My grandfather bought that land long before anyone imagined a subdivision would ever surround it. The forest, the old cabin, and every acre had passed in my family for generations. After he died, the property finally became mine, and I thought the deed in my safe was all the protection I would ever need. At first, I had no problem with construction next door. The developer had every right to build on the land they actually owned. Weeks passed, then months, and more houses began appearing. I never imagined their project would eventually reach my side of the boundary. One afternoon, I noticed a new road running much closer to my boundary than it should have. I found one of my grandfather's old survey markers and checked the map. The road appeared to cross a line that had never changed. That's when I realized I needed a professional survey. The surveyor spent 2 days checking old markers and official coordinates. She compared the original records with the new construction layout. Then she looked at me and said something I will never forget. The development had crossed onto my family's land. When I showed Victoria the survey, she actually laughed. She said 52 homes were already under construction, and nobody was stopping the project now. According to her, the developer's paperwork had already been approved. I told her approval didn't magically transfer ownership of my land. I expected the developer to stop and investigate. Instead, the construction continued as if I had never said a word. More foundations were poured, more frames went up, and more families prepared to move in. So I decided I would stop arguing and start gathering evidence. I documented every new foundation and every house that crossed the disputed area. I kept copies of the survey, photographs, and every conversation with the HOA. I wasn't trying to scare the families buying those homes. I was making sure the truth would still exist when construction dust settled. Eventually, families started moving into the first finished homes. That was the moment the HOA became completely confident. They believed that once people were living there, the problem would simply disappear. But a house doesn't erase the history written into a deed. That night, I returned to my grandfather's cabin and opened the old family safe. Inside was the original deed, preserved with records going back decades. The legal description matched the survey exactly, and it proved my family had never sold the land beneath part of that development. I called an attorney and told him I had the original deed. He asked me one question. Had the developer ever shown proof that my family sold that land? The answer was no, and after reviewing my documents, he told me it was time to take the evidence to court. My attorney studied the deed line by line and compared it with the survey. Then he checked the development records and found something even more troubling. There was no signed document showing my family had ever transferred that land. For the first time, I knew this wasn't just a boundary disagreement anymore. A few days later, the HOA finally received the court papers. Victoria's confidence disappeared the moment she saw the property description attached to the case. The same land she had dismissed as mine was now being examined by the court, and suddenly nobody was laughing at my survey anymore. Victoria tried telling the board that the developer had handled everything, but the board members wanted to know why no one had verified the original property records. The more documents they reviewed, the more serious the questions became. Their biggest project was now sitting in the middle of a courtroom dispute. The developer went back to his own files looking for an answer. He had approvals, construction plans, and newer parcel documents. But the one thing everyone needed was missing. Nobody could produce proof that Daniel's family had ever sold the disputed land. The day of a hearing finally arrived. I walked into that courthouse, carrying the same deed my grandfather had protected for decades. Across the entrance, Victoria and the HOA board looked far less confident than before. Now the facts would speak for themselves. My attorney placed the original deed before the court. Then he displayed the legal description beside the professional survey. The lines matched perfectly. Part of the 52-home development stood on land my family still legally owned. For a moment, the entire courtroom became completely silent. The evidence wasn't based on opinions or HOA rules. It was based on the original chain of ownership and the recorded property boundaries. And those records told a story nobody on the HOA side could change. The judge took time to review every document submitted to the court. Historical records were compared with the newer development paperwork. The court also examined how the disputed boundary had been handled before construction began. Every answer brought the focus back to one simple question: who legally owned the land? When the decision came, the court recognized my legal ownership of the disputed property. The HOA and developer could no longer pretend the original deed didn't exist. The future of those 52 homes would have to be handled through the proper legal process. But one thing was finally clear: my family's land was still ours. I drove back to the old cabin and stood where my grandfather once stood. The forest was still there, the cabin was still there, and the deed was still in my hands. They had built 52 homes before anyone bothered to check who owned the land. In the end, I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth had been written down long before they arrived.